cool enough in here. Everybody's cool enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
If it gets a little warm, I'll turn it back up. So tonight's talk is on the Yasa Sutta, a sutta on entanglements, and depending on how long I talk, I might cite a couple of other suttas. It's a very, it's a short sutta, it's simple, but it really gets to the heart of the matter, and it's very important. We'll meditate first, so find your relaxed meditative posture. And gently close your eyes and gently close your mouths. And take a moment to become aware of the sensation of breathing in your body. Just get a feel for what that's like. To be mindful of your breath in your body. And while remaining mindful of your breath in your body, notice that thoughts are flowing. We're conscious beings, thoughts should be flowing. The purpose of meditation is to not be distracted by your own thoughts. So when you find that you're caught up in your thinking again, simply acknowledge that and return your mindfulness to the sensation of breathing. I'll repeat that. When you find that you're caught up in your thinking again, simply acknowledge that and return your mindfulness to the sensation of breathing. Relaxing your thoughts, remaining mindful of your breathing. And we'll meditate for 20 minutes with callbacks every 5 minutes. Relaxing thoughts, remaining mindful of your breathing. Relaxing thoughts, remaining mindful of your breathing. Relaxing thoughts, remaining mindful of your breathing. If a persistent thought or feeling arises, stay with it for a moment or two. Recognize it as impermanent and return your mindfulness to the sensation of breathing. And we'll meditate for 5 more minutes. take a moment to notice the quality of your mind. Be at peace with your mind. And when you're ready, rise. So usually during the last 5 minutes of my meditation here, I start thinking about what I'll be teaching, and I might take a look at it. And looking at this, I started really going off on, and you'll understand this a little more when I read the article itself, but how far away from the Dhamma some so-called Buddhist organizations have gotten, and how that has led through the people of any particular order or lineage, because of their self-identification and their strong identification with the group. Some pretty awful behavior. And that relates back to dependent origination. We developed this group mentality, and again, this will be a little bit more clear when I read this. We've developed this group mentality, and because we're part of this group, and that group is ignoring things that are directly hurtful in some ways, that ignorance allows us to continue and to support that. I'm thinking in particular of one organization that their name references the Shamatha-Vipassana and the Triple Refuge, and the founder, the guy is still the head of this, is a known and accused sexual predator. This is a worldwide organization, and the group continues. And it really is unfortunate, and it leads to this. And I'm using that not to beat the guy up, or even the people that are part of it. I know some of the people that are part of the organization, they're wonderful people. But because of our entanglements, let me back up just a little bit. This is a very good example of how our entanglements with the world and with particular groups can continue our own ignorance of what's right in front of us. And the Buddha teaches this directly. This is 2,600 years ago. Now, there's other groups, and I could give a whole list of modern Buddhist so-called groups that have taken on special names to kind of show their own specialness within the modern Buddhist lexicon. And that's still the same thing. You're creating an identity. One of the most interesting things about the Buddha's Sangha, the very first Sangha, is it was never given a name. They never felt the need to call themselves anything. The only reference to the Sangha at all is when a place is identified. In other words, I think the sutta begins when the Buddha is in Savatthi at Jita's Grove. It never says anything like, oh, this is the flying white lotus Sangha or anything. It's just, there's no need to create an identity over these things. And if you think about the problem of eye-making, anytime we create an identity with a group at all, in any way, we're continuing clinging. And we're almost bound to follow wherever that group goes. So let me get to the sutta. And what I just said hopefully will be a little bit more clear. This short sutta teaches that developing the wisdom of the Buddha will bring the ability to avoid self-aggrandizing and the distraction that comes from creating a Dhamma practice that is dependent on external entanglements as its theme. And that's just relating back to creating special practices and then creating a group name about it, and now I've become part of that group. Even when I was practicing in a Tibetan lineage and then later the Zen lineage, there was always this subtle but very powerful push to become one of them and engage in their kind of special practices. And the subtle and sometimes not so subtle inference was that what other people were doing wasn't quite as advanced as what we're doing. And the most curious thing about that, when I finally left those groups and studied what the Buddha was teaching, none of them were teaching what the Buddha actually taught, which I think was part of the problem there. I'll read 2 additional suttas too to show how 2 monks developed the understanding of the importance of seclusion in the Dhamma practice. So the overarching theme of this is the need to also have seclusion as part of your Dhamma practice. And that doesn't mean that we should, especially those of us that are living in the world, he's teaching a group of monks and nuns. Our seclusion is established in our meditation practice. That's so important. And one of the reasons why I taught this sutta probably the first 3 years ago, is that I noticed that many people that were coming to our class regularly were using that as the only time to meditate. And there needs to be more of an effort there on that. Consistent participation with a well-focused Sangha is very important in developing a useful Dhamma practice, but overindulgence and dependence on a group practice is counterproductive to developing the Dhamma, especially if the group you're attending is into every kind of new age thing that's going on today. That's not to say that's a bad thing, but if you want to develop the Buddha's Dhamma, you have to be part of a Sangha that's actually focused on that and not just everything that comes along. While the Buddha always emphasized the importance of a well-focused Sangha, he also taught that Dhamma practice depends on and flourishes in seclusion. As in all things with the Buddha's teaching, the middle way is the guiding principle, the Yasa Sutta. The Buddha was teaching in Ikanagala. The locals all knew of the Buddha as a rightly self-awakened human being who was unexcelled as a teacher and whose teachings are entirely useful and practical. They were a close-knit group who depended on their group for direction and guidance rather than the Buddha's direct teaching. So they probably picked a little bit of what the Buddha was teaching, but in their group they decided, well, this is going to be our practice. And again, that identification with the group allows you to continue your ignorance. Everybody else is doing it, so it must be good. It must be something that's useful because all my friends are doing it. They prepared a feast with many delicacies for the Buddha and his Sangha. They approached the Buddha's dwelling and began making a noisy racket. The Venerable Nagita was attending the Buddha. The Buddha asked Nagita what the racket was about. Great teacher, those are the locals who have brought many delicacies to honor you and the Sangha. Buddha's response is interesting. Nagita, I do not seek honor or recognition. Whoever cannot obtain through their own understanding and with ease, as I do, the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of self-awakening, let them consent to this common pleasure, this dulling pleasure, this pleasure born of gain and of receiving offerings and fame. So the Buddha has recognized that the locals have created a group identity through their association that overemphasized their association and that created a type of worship of the Buddha. And again, this is without even learning from the Buddha, but they decided, well, the Buddha, we have his reputation, he's going to be our point of worship rather than actually learn from this human being. The Buddha never set himself up as a god or as anybody to be worshipped, simply respected for what he taught. That overemphasized their association, that created a type of worship of the Buddha that dismissed important aspects of the Eightfold Path and allowed them to avoid seclusion. So their own self-identification and the strategies that they use to continue ignorance. On the outside, it looked pretty wonderful. Here's this group of seemingly dedicated people, and they're getting together regularly, talking about compassionate and wholesome things. But that strategy allowed them to not actually develop the Eightfold Path. They were doing something that looked good. They might even have called themselves Buddhists or something, like many people do today, without actually developing the Buddha's teachings. Oh, sorry, I lost my page. Nagita says, great teacher, please relent now. The locals will follow you because of your virtue and your understanding. Again, Nagita, I do not seek honor or recognition. Whoever cannot obtain through their own understanding and with ease, as I do, the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of self-awakening, let them consent to this common pleasure, meaning let them go on with their way. Let them consent to this common pleasure, this dulling pleasure, pleasure born of gain and of receiving offerings and fame. Another important point that should be made here, one of the reasons why the Buddha is putting off this group is he doesn't want to reinforce in their minds that he's someone who should be worshipped. He's trying to make the point, you can't worship me. We can't really learn from someone that we worship, can we? Because if we're setting someone up as a god, then what we're expecting is that that god will bring us whatever we're looking for, will bestow awakening or whatever it is. And the Buddha knew immediately, if they're stuck in that point of view, seeing him as a god to be worshipped, there's nothing for him to teach. And he's making a very strong point, where some people would say, well, why didn't he just let him in right away? Why is he being so hard on him? It's exactly for that reason. He knows that they need to be willing to face their own ignorance if his teachings are going to be of any value. The Buddha continues, there are many who are unable to develop the understanding with ease that leads to the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of self-awakening. When people all live together, assemble together, and live committed to dwelling with a group, they are unable to develop understanding with ease, which is why they live together, assemble together, and live committed to dwelling with the group. They just continue that strategy of reinforcing their own polluted thinking. And a group is always a good vehicle for doing that. Nagita, when I see a community delighting in their interactions, laughing loudly, grabbing at one another, I know that they will not be able to develop the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of self-awakening, which is why they are delighting in their interactions, laughing loudly and grabbing at one another. The Buddha is referring to they've now created a situation where the simple social act of being part of a group is developing awakening. Then there are those communities who revel in food, eating as much as they want, who take pleasure in sensory contact, pleasure in lying down, pleasure in dullness. I know that they will not be able to develop the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of self-awakening. Having eaten as much as they want, taking pleasure from sensory contact, from lying down in dullness, meaning you work yourself up to such a point that all you can do is just lie down. We've all done that a few times, eating a little bit too much and needing that. Then there are those who attempt to develop concentration in a community where disturbance is likely, meaning they haven't developed a well-focused Sangha, even though they might be meditating, they're involved in every other kind of thing, where disturbance is likely. This, I know, is not conducive to developing the Dhamma. But those that have found the root of a tree or an empty hut, well secluded, even though they may be drowsy, they will dispel their drowsiness and be mindful of their seclusions. The Buddha, when he gives meditation instruction, and there's not a lot to it, he would always preface that with, go find the root of a tree or an empty hut, meaning go separate yourself from the world for a few short minutes at least during your meditation practice. That's more important than anything else. Then there are those that have established seclusion and are not well concentrated. Meditating in seclusion, they will quickly develop concentration and will protect their concentration. They will end their distracted mind and be mindful of their seclusion. So even if the Buddha is pointing out that even if in the beginning you're not well concentrated, if you establish a meditation practice, eventually you'll develop a well concentrated mind. Then there are those that have established seclusion and are well concentrated. They will develop clinging release. They have found the benefit from seclusion. Then there are those that cling to a group and takes food, clothes, shelter, and recognition from the group and becomes enamored with the group. They do not establish seclusion and will not end distraction. Again, this is kind of referencing to people that in the past they used to come here and they meditate once a week, and that's fine. I don't say you can't come here anymore. But the point of this is if you're going to develop a practice, it has to be more than just here. But also there's many, many people. I used to go up to a monastery up in, I need to mention, people will figure it out. And they might have 150 people there on I think it was Sundays when they would meet. And I got to talking to most of the people. We'd have a little meal afterward. And I was surprised how many people admitted that the only time they meditate is when they go up to this particular monastery. And there's not much benefit in that. But that was the only frame of reference they had, is to meditate there in this group. And unfortunately, there wasn't any teachings in that monastery about developing the Eightfold Path and developing an ongoing meditation practice on your own. Nagita, then there are those well established in seclusion who receives food, clothes, shelter, and recognition from a group, knowing the benefit of seclusion and restraint. No disturbance will arise in that. Last line, knowing the benefit of restraint. Again, the Buddha doesn't mention the Four Noble Truths of the Eightfold Path in his sutta, but he always taught this in context. And that point of restraint is pointing directly to the Eightfold Path. They're also developing the Eightfold Path as part of their Dhamma practice, and they're learning the benefit of seclusion as also part of that Dhamma practice. That's the end of that sutta. Let me just go a little bit further with this, though. The Yasa Sutta shows the importance of dismissing praise, even in very subtle ways, for developing a Dhamma. It also shows how seeking external validation for Dhamma practice will lead to further distraction and confusion through group confirmation and conformation and confirmation. The Buddha presents very simple and direct meditation instruction and consistently teaches to find the root of a tree or an empty hut for meditation and seclusion. Throughout the Pali Canon, the Buddha teaches the importance of seclusion as a singularly necessary component of meditation practice. While the Buddha's Sangha would occasionally meditate as a group, they would congregate as a community primarily to hear a teaching by the Buddha or from one of the senior monks or nuns. Even though the Sangha lived together in monasteries and they often traveled as a group all over northern India, most of the monks and nuns had a solitary meditation practice. There wasn't a formal meditation sit, say once or twice or 3 times a day, which is what's often done in monasteries today. It's often, it was encouraged that you go off by yourself and have your seclusion. That was an important part of your Dhamma practice. I'm going to just read another few sections from a sutta. In the Bala Sutta, the Buddha asked Sariputta, Sariputta was one of the senior monks, of the importance of seclusion and the Eightfold Path and the defilements of craving, aversion, and deluded thinking. Sariputta says, the mind of a monk whose defilements are ended inclines towards seclusion. They lean towards seclusion. They tend towards seclusion. They stay in seclusion and delight in renunciation, entirely rid of the qualities that act as a basis for the defilements. Kind of a long sentence to say that we need to remove ourselves from the entanglements of the world, even if it's just occasionally during a meditation practice or within a well-focused Sangha, in order to recognize where our entanglements are, don't we? We need to see it. And we need to recognize the benefit of it and experience it. And the only way we can do it is to be disentangled, at least for a few moments. It's really unfortunate how many so-called Dharma practices are really just social gatherings that reinforce entanglements. Sariputta continues, the fact that the mind of a monk whose defilements are ended inclines towards seclusion, leans towards seclusion, tends towards seclusion, stays in seclusion and delights in renunciation, entirely rid of the qualities that act as a basis for the defilements, is also the strength of a monk whose defilements are ended. Their strength comes from their seclusion. Sariputta continues, the Noble Eightfold Path is well developed by a monk whose defilements are ended. The fact that the Noble Eightfold Path is well developed by a monk whose defilements are ended is the strength of a monk ended. Whose defilements are ended, with reference to which he affirms the ending of the defilements, meaning he acknowledges within himself, thus the defilements are ended within me. We know it. We've had the experience of that. In the Viveka Sutta, a monk sitting in seclusion considers the importance of withdrawing from worldly entanglements. Desiring seclusion, I have entered the forest, and yet my mind goes running outside. If I subdue my desire for people, then I will be happy and free from passion. So there's a little bit more to the article, but that last little bit, that monk needed to be in seclusion to recognize what was going on in his mind was an attachment. The reason why his mind was racing is because it was attached to things outside of his seclusion. But if he didn't put himself in that place of seclusion, and if he didn't have the framework of the Eightfold Path to recognize what was occurring in his own mind, he would have just continued. And he might have been a meditator for many, many, many years, but he never would have achieved anything that was useful because he didn't have the proper context to see what was going on in his own mind. Excuse me. That's why I place so much emphasis, like the Buddha did. Practice is primarily for deepening concentration. It's not for having experiences. It's not even as a direct way for gaining insight into certain things. And the reason why I say that is there's some practices that are taught that you bring a concept or an idea or a thought or a problem into your meditation and meditate on that. That's not meditation as far as the Buddha taught. It's mostly off of our cushion from a well-concentrated mind that can support the refined mindfulness of the Eightfold Path, that is able to gain useful insight, and it's useful insight into the 3 marks of existence. That's really the only theme that's important to develop insight into, because if we can develop insight into the impermanent nature of all things, the not self-characteristic, and the resulting suffering from a misunderstanding of the interplay of those first 2, then we'll awaken. When the Buddha first taught the Four Noble Truths, Kandana, who awakened after hearing that very brief first teaching, said, all conditioned things that arise are subject to cessation. What he is referring to is the impermanence of all things and the conditioned nature of the not self-characteristic. When he said that, the Buddha said, basically, Kandana, you're awakened. You got it. You understand it. None of that can be done unless we develop part of our practice in seclusion that supports the entire Eightfold Path. So that's the sutta for today. So thank you. Any questions about the sutta, and then we'll just go around the room. Is it clear that it's the entanglements in the world that continue our monkey mind and our distraction and really hinder our Dhamma practice? And ultimately what we're doing is disentangling ourselves from the world. It doesn't mean that we're not participating in the world. We're simply not creating identities about what we're attached to in the world. And this sutta was talking about not creating identities about any particular kind of a Protestant group, just to clarify that. Kevin, good to see you tonight.
Good to see you, John. Really like this talk. I sort of feel that I like the other sutta you gave this week too. So I feel that both of them, sort of this theme of duality is sort of, coming to the surface in these teachings here. The practice on your own and then the practice within the Sangha, and they both need to be cultivated. And that whole thing, like you just said earlier, the tranquility and insight, that's what it's for. The Shamatha-Vipassana that supports sort of, and then our practice as it is separate from the world's awakening. It's sort of, that's why we do it. It'd be great for the world to be on that same page, and, but that's sort of a separate thing, and you can get attached to that, right?
Oh yeah.
Like, why can't all this happen? Or, I need to have this cause to get the world to do this. But when we find out from real wisdom from this whole practice, emptying the ignorance, it's right in front of us all day. Right? Every moment, it's right here. Yeah. But the not self, the anatta, sort of wants to look everywhere but right there, because it's, the whole undoing is right in front of you.
Yep. And the perfect strategy is to think that you're going to save the world. It's the biggest distraction. It's a direct First Noble Truth, and it's a direct contradiction to the Buddha's teachings. The Buddha didn't see himself as a savior. He didn't see his teachings as salvific in any way. He simply taught a very practical and direct way for people to awaken, gain full human maturity, and stop contributing to the suffering of the world.
It's the perfect solution to further on it.
Yeah.
Right.
The most loving thing anybody can do, the most loving thing I can do, is to take to the Dhamma and awaken. That includes everyone. At least I am not contributing to the suffering of the world, and maybe I can have a little bit of a positive effect like the Buddha did. So the Shamatha Sutta is part of that too, and the Yuganada Sutta. They're all part of it. Glad you're here tonight. Tim, good to see you.
John, good to see you. This sutta, I really, really like the sutta. The sutta, when I read it earlier, and then hearing you again talk about the sutta, it was an aha moment. And the Buddha's responses were just so wonderful, because we are alone, we are individuals, and when we're in a group, or if people are in a group and that starts happening, it's going against everything that Dhamma is.
Yeah,
really.
That's right. That's right.
I think because the Dhamma is not about the group; it's about you as an individual and your journey on your path. And the Buddha, how can I say this? It's a conditioned mind that wants to be part of the group. You know, it's a condition, and then with that comes certain people being sycophants, and all these entanglements just start cascading.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that it's bad, but when in this practice, in the Eightfold Path, there's no place for it.
That's right.
I mean, that's at least what I felt the Buddha was stating in a very complicated way. The Buddha said it much simpler.
Yeah.
And the thing about the seclusion, yeah, I mean, I meditate twice a day, and I have to make sure I am at a root of a tree. Symbolically.
Yeah.
Like I told you before, because when I'm not, and the phone rings or someone comes in the door, it breaks my seclusion. It breaks it, and it's being secluded and meditating and getting that concentration for you for the rest of the day, for the rest of the week, and hopefully life.
Yeah.
And so those are the kind of things that sutta brought up to me as I read it. Yeah, it's really, really.
And it is. You read it correctly too. Many people misinterpret this particular point and say, well, that's so incredibly selfish to just awaken for yourself. It's the essence of selflessness, because the whole point of the Buddhist teachings is to recognize I'm making and concede as the problem and abandon it. And the only way we can do that, if you think about what the basic problem is conceited views, self-referential views. How could you address those in a group that supports ignoring those things? So think back to the Buddha's first Sangha. Very quickly, there was well over 1,000 monks and very quickly some nuns, and that continued to grow. So they weren't isolated, but they had developed a practice that allowed them to have seclusion while being in a very well-focused Sangha. I mentioned the Ratana Sutta earlier. It's such a perfect example of that. These weren't selfish people. They were incredibly selfless, led by, I shouldn't even use that, guided by the Buddha. So they came across this town that was devastated by floods and disease. They weren't detached and they just, oh, well, that's not my problem. I'm a meditator. I don't have any. They immediately attended to the needs of the people in the town, made sure that they took care of them as best as they could, gave them food, attended to, the stories, the long version of it is rather long, how they attended to their needs and gave them medicine and, did everything they could. And then they taught them the Dhamma. And that's a true refuge. They were able to do that because they had great compassion, but they also had great wisdom to go along with it. There's rules that the Buddha developed for that Sangha. But the most important rule that he reiterated was, when you are gathered as a Sangha, we talk only about the Dhamma. We don't get into other things. We don't bring in other teachers. We don't listen to, well, they didn't have tapes in, but all these things that were, people have asked me to do here, and I've always resisted, because just let's have one place, maybe, in the whole world where the Buddhist teachings are respected and honored. And we don't need to add anything else to it. And the only way to see it clearly and develop it is to keep it in its pure form as we possibly can. And it even getting tangled with the world. So, Margaret, good to see you again tonight. How's your practice going, and do you have any questions or comments?
I'm just thinking a lot about how I trust in that the of focusing on yourself here, right?
Yep.
That change is right immediately available to you.
Yes.
But I'm struggling. We've also seen plenty of examples recently of the destruction that comes with that alignment with a group.
Yep.
But I also struggle with the fact that a lot of my entanglements are with people that are organizing around positive and bring about positive change.
Yep.
In the world. So I don't know how to reconcile that.
The problem is that we feel that we have to reconcile it, that we can't let things be discrete and stand on their own. So you can fully develop the Buddha's teachings on the Eightfold Path and still be engaged socially. And it will only make you more effective in whatever things you may be involved with. But you also might find a little bit different perspective on social engagement. You might realize that some of it is pushing a rock up a hill. And I'm not saying you will. But a lot of what is called today social or engaged Buddhism is lacking a lot of the wisdom of the Buddha. So that's not to say that we shouldn't be concerned about what's going on in the world and take care of people. But we can do that from a much more mindful way if we develop the Eightfold Path. So it's not to say that you shouldn't be doing things or even supporting your friends in what they're doing. It's really two separate things. One of the reasons why we try to reconcile everything is because we think we need to have this unified view. And that unified view itself is part of the problem. The Buddha taught a way to see everything in its discreteness. Kevin mentioned duality and non-duality. The idea, the non-dual ideal, is something that is rooted in the Vedas and the Upanishads, but the Buddha studied and rejected them because they didn't lead to his goal of understanding the true nature of suffering. So the world at large, I might be getting even too far from what your question was inferring. The world at large wants to see everything tied up in one nice little basket, and it wants to have a unified view of everything, and that everything is interdependent and interconnected. And there's some physical truth to that. But on a practical way of developing awakening, what's most important is to recognize a lack of understanding of Four Noble Truths. And then as that develops, whatever flows from that is going to be rooted in wisdom. So as you develop the Eightfold Path, you may prove to be an inspiration to some of your friends too. It doesn't mean that you have to say, well, they're wrong and this is right. It really is two different things. The Buddha didn't take up causes, but he also didn't shy away from what was going on in his society. And he was consistently guiding kings and governors and other people of power. And he was consistently addressing the needs of wherever he was in northern India, the local people. But he did it in a very direct, and I would say even a non-confrontational way, which is really remarkable when you read some of the suttas about how he was counseling, ready to go off onto war with another kingdom. He didn't condemn him. In fact, he understood that there was nothing he could do to stop that. But what he counseled the kings on repeatedly is, when you've won the war, treat the people that you have beaten with dignity. Take care of them, which is a remarkable teaching. And another thing about, and again, Margaret, I might be getting into an area you're not even considering, so excuse me. Buddha described the First Noble Truth as saying dukkha occurs, which means that every type of mild disappointment, unsatisfactoriness, all the way up to extreme suffering is simply part of being in the world. It's going to occur. There's nothing we can do about that. As society has developed, we've developed all types of things. It's, some is very hurtful towards people, and some is very helpful. What is most effective, I guess I'm saying the same thing again, what is most effective is to awaken first, I think. And then you can contribute in a wise and mindful way to what's going on into the world. This is just what the Buddha did. It's an important question. So thank you for bringing it up. Did I bring you some clarity, or did I make you more confused? Good. Any other questions about tonight's talk? Or the other things that we touched on? Okay. Well, let's finish with the Metta Sutta like we always do. So find your relaxed meditative posture and gently close your eyes and gently close your mouths. And again, take a moment to become aware of the sensation of breathing in your body, and let that mindfulness of your breath cease any distracting thoughts to the past or to the future, or that may have come up from our talk today. And metta means goodwill or loving kindness. And these are the Buddha's words on metta from the Karaniya Metta Sutta. This is what should be done by one who is skilled in goodness and who knows the path of peace. Let them be able and upright, straightforward and gentle in speech, humble and not conceited, contented and easily satisfied, unburdened with duties and frugal in their ways, peaceful and calm and wise and skillful, not proud or demanding in nature. Let them not do the slightest thing that the wise would later reprove. Wishing in gladness and in safety, may all beings be at ease. Whatever living beings there may be, whether they are weak or strong, omitting none, the great or the mighty, medium, short, or small, the seen and the unseen, those living near and far away, those born and to be born, may all beings be at ease. Let none deceive another or despise any being in any state. Let none through anger or ill will wish harm upon another. Even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings. Radiating kindness over the entire world, spreading upwards to the skies and downwards to the depths, outwards and unbounded, freed from hatred and ill will. Whether standing or walking, seated or lying down, free from drowsiness, one should sustain this recollection. This is said to be the sublime abiding. By not holding to fixed views, the pure-hearted one, having clarity of vision, being freed from all sense desires, is not born again into this world. Thank you all for a wonderful class. Peace.
So we don't have to clean up, right?
Yeah, these can stay right here. Tim, have you considered going on the retreat?
I have, but is there one in the spring?
Yep.
I think this spring would be something I would want to do.
Good.
I